Good morning, honorable members and our distinguished participants. My name is Edna Kangoya Ziambo from the Zambian Parliament. I'm the committee clerk for this committee. I wish to inform all distinguished participants that our chairperson has a challenge with logging in, and we're trying to get him on board. We apologize for starting the meeting a little bit late, but we'll be starting shortly. Please bear with us. Thank you.
Good morning, honorable members and distinguished participants. Let me recognize the presence of our vice chairperson of the committee and of course the Secretary General of the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Pleasure to warmly welcome you to our two-day engagement. Let me thank all of you great points. Today we're going to discuss the agreement and in particular the SADC. It would be very remiss of me not to mention that yesterday we had a fantastic session which was proficiently led by Trudy. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Ms. Trudy Heisenberg is the Executive Director at TRALAC and an expert of several accomplishments in the area under discussion. Let me invite all of us to take advantage of her expertise by actively engaging her. You to address us.
Good morning, Honourable Chair, Honourable Members, Honourable SG. It's a great pleasure to join you again this morning for our discussion. I'm going to share my screen with you, and so we'll just stop my video for now. And this morning, of course, we are focusing very much on the relationship between the African Continental Free Trade Area and regional economic communities. And we will focus, of course, very much on the Southern African Development Community, SADC. Honourable members, what I have this morning is to provide an overview of the relationship in terms of the legal and institutional architecture of the African Continental Free Trade Area and the regional economic communities of our continent, and also to take a look at what the future relationship will look like from a practical perspective. With your indulgence, I do have a few slides just to take a look at the impact of COVID, because of course COVID has effectively meant that our negotiations, which are still ongoing to complete the African Continental Free Trade Area, have been put on hold, as we mentioned yesterday, so that we could not start trading on the 1st of July as we had anticipated. As we mentioned, we are awaiting news from our heads of state and government who will decide when the new target date for the start of trade under the regime of the African Continental Free Trade Area will be. Very briefly then, to start our overview of the discussion, the relationship between the AFCFTA and regional economic communities is addressed very specifically in the agreement in a number of provisions and parts of the overall legal architecture and the ecosystem that is created by the AFCFTA suite of legal instruments. We have, ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, as we saw yesterday, we have the umbrella agreement, the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, and then we have a number of protocols, the Protocol on Trade in Goods, Protocol on Trade and Services, and the Protocol on Dispute Settlement. And under each one of those protocols, we of course have a number of annexes dealing with very specific issues, as we mentioned yesterday. That completes phase one of the negotiations and of the first phase of the development of the legal and institutional architecture. We are yet to begin, and we hope that this will happen early in the new year, negotiations on phase two issues. And those are, of course, investment, competition, and intellectual property. And our member states have agreed that the level of ambition for those phase two issues will be to cooperate with one another on the implementation of those important disciplines. But very briefly, if we take a look at the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, Article 19 specifically addresses the relationship between the continental AFCFTA and regional economic communities. And it states unambiguously that regional economic communities will continue to exist. It also specifically mentions that existing trade arrangements will continue to exist. And this is particularly important because this finds synergy with one of the foundational principles of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and that is the principle of the acquis. And our colleagues from French-speaking countries will be able to provide a better interpretation of the term than I may do, but it basically means that we will build on what exists already. So it means that we will take a look at the regional economic communities, not only the trade arrangements, but the comprehensive agendas of the regional economic communities, what they have achieved already. We will not undo any of what has been achieved, but we will build further on what exists already. And I think this is extremely important. The acquis as a principle of the AFCFTA is not given a specific definition. And I'm going to come back to say a little bit about the origins of the acquis and our regional integration and trade discourse a little bit later when we look at the tripartite free trade area. Because although the tripartite free trade area, this important initiative among the member states of SADC, East African Community, and COMESA is not yet in force, it is an important trade arrangement in the making. And this is the first context in which we came across this principle of the acquis. So we will come back to that in a little bit later in the presentation. So a fundamental question, honorable members, is what will the African Continental Free Trade Area add to existing regional economic communities and trading arrangements? And I think this is really where we start to see recognition for what exists already in SADC and the other regional economic communities, and the value addition, the specific value addition of the AFCFTA to our continent-wide integration strategy and agenda. Honorable members, what is particularly important is that if we look at the perspective from trade, in particular in intra-Africa trade, what we do recognize is that, for example, it is so important to note that intra-Africa trade is highly concentrated within sub-regions. And if we take a look at total intra-Africa trade, honorable members, as we mentioned yesterday, African countries in total, if we look at all the member states of the African Union, then global trade relationships are still predominant. We trade mostly with our global trade partners. And the data for 2019, which I had a look at quite recently, indicates that 15% of Africa's total trade is actually amongst the members on the continent. So total trade, 85% is still with global trade partners. It is also important to keep in mind that much of that global trade is still trade in commodities. Many of our countries are still exporting commodities which are not processed, where value addition takes place in the global centers of industrial development, not on the continent. And that, of course, makes our discussion yesterday about the synergies between the African Continental Free Trade Area and other flagship projects of the African Union, such as the Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa, AIDA, such an important one. So if we take a look at intra-Africa trade, what we do see of this 15% of Africa's total trade that actually takes place on the continent, more than half of that takes place in SADC. So it means that SADC is an anchor. It is a cluster of intra-Africa trade. Most, in terms of more than a majority, more than 50% of intra-Africa trade actually takes place among the SADC member states. If we further delve a little bit more deeply into the data, we find that 42% of Africa's total intra-Africa trade takes place within the members of the Southern African Customs Union. So highly concentrated. And in this picture, honorable members, I have highlighted the role of South Africa. South Africa is the large anchor economy in the Southern African region. And of course, South Africa's trade with other SADC members certainly plays a very important role. So South Africa, my country, I've asked a question here, and each one of us as SADC member states can ask exactly this question. What new opportunities will there be for Zimbabwe, for Zambia, for Tanzania, for Angola, for Namibia, for all of the SADC member states? What will the African Continental Free Trade Area add to what we have already? And this is a very integrated trade space that exists at the Southern African region of the continent. So this is the important question that we have to look at. Now that we know that the regional economic communities will continue to exist, let's look at what will the African Continental Free Trade Area add to what exists already. And an important question in this regard, honorable members, brings us back to the ongoing negotiations among the member states. The member states are exchanging tariff offers at the moment. They are taking a look at opportunities with countries and markets where they do not have a trade relationship yet. But they are also looking at their domestic development priorities and identifying sectors which they may identify as sensitive, that they may not want to reduce the tariffs. So there's a lot of introspection, a lot of analytical work ongoing at the moment as the member states prepare their tariff offers. The fundamental question is, who will negotiate with whom? And this is extremely important when we take a look at the status of regional integration on the continent in the different regional economic communities. We recognize here that some regional economic communities are customs unions. So the Southern African Customs Union, the East African Customs Union, in ECOWAS we have a customs union, and also in Central Africa in the ECAS region, the Economic Community of Central African States. Since these customs unions have a common external tariff, they have the same trade policy towards other trade partners. They will negotiate as a collective. They will develop a tariff offer as a collective. So as an example, the member states of SACU, they will have discussions amongst themselves and come up with a common tariff offer to other member states. The East African Community does the same, ECOWAS, and the ECAS group belonging to the Customs Union will do exactly the same. So the question really is, who will we be negotiating with whom? And if we start with the Customs Union within SADC, so with SACU, the SACU member states do not have any agreement at this stage with countries in West Africa or North Africa or Central Africa. The members of SACU belong to SADC, and Tanzania, which belongs to SADC, also belongs to the East African Community. But beyond that, the SADC members that belong to COMESA, we find the overlap of membership quite important between SADC and COMESA, has to be taken into account as well. So the bottom line, honorable members, is that the members of SADC will not enter into new negotiations with one another. In the same way, the members of COMESA will not enter into new negotiations with one another. But let's take an example of Zambia. Zambia is a member of SADC and COMESA. It belongs to 2 free trade areas. And Zambia will make, or Malawi, or one of the other SADC member states that is not a member of SACU or the East African Community, will be looking at making a tariff concession offer to all the other member states on the continent. And in return, they will be negotiating with Malawi, Zambia, or Zimbabwe, as the case may be. So a very important part of the exercise of taking a look at how much further liberalization we will get on the continent is to recognize that what the African Continental Free Trade Area actually does is to fill in the gaps between existing trade arrangements and regional economic communities, leaving the existing RECs and the trading arrangements intact. So it really is filling and adding to what we don't have yet in terms of trade relationships. Honorable members, this is just a picture of the regional economic communities. And keep in mind that the African Union, if we go back to the Abuja Treaty of 1991, it entered into force in 1994. It really is that broad integration plan for the continent. And it identified 8 regional economic communities as the building blocks of eventually the African Economic Community. And so these are quite important. SADC is recognized as one. SACU is not recognized, but because SACU is fully contained within SADC, I have also represented it here. So this is the COMESA region, SADC, ECOWAS. That's the Arab Maghreb Union. This is the Sensad Sahel region. This is the East African Community. And this is the Central African, the ECAS region. So these regional economic communities will exist, will continue to exist. So if we just take a look at an example, the member states in SADC at this stage have no free trade agreement with the countries in West Africa or North Africa or the Sensad region, or some of these countries in Central Africa. So they will be opening up new opportunities that do not at this stage, that are not at this stage covered by a regional trade agreement. So this is quite important to keep in mind, that the African Continental Free Trade Area respects and acknowledges the existence of regional integration in the regional economic communities, which is extremely important. Some of these integration initiatives have a long history. The integration levels have reached very deep manifestations in terms of the integration, not only in trade, honorable members, but also in value chain development, services, movement of persons, and so on. So they have a very comprehensive agenda. Some, as SADC does, of course, goes much beyond a trade arrangement. And this, I think, is quite an important issue to keep in mind, that if we look at the membership of our regional economic communities, we do still find that some members of a regional economic community, they are a member of the community, they have signed and ratified the treaty establishing the regional economic community, but they may not yet be part of the trading arrangement. So in the case of SADC, for example, we understand that Angola, very important member of SADC, has recently submitted a tariff offer to accede to the SADC free trade area. So there is a lot of activity within the regional economic communities on the trade front, but also we have to keep in mind that our regional economic communities have much more comprehensive agendas. And if we just think about all the protocols that SADC member states have concluded, there are protocols on gender, on education, on tourism, on transport, on energy. It covers a very, very comprehensive development agenda. So the richness of that development agenda of the regional economic communities has to be taken into account. And some of the protocols, for example, in SADC that relate to the services sectors, such as transport, communication, and so on, are really important. And of course, the finance and investment protocol dealing with financial services and investment are very important, because in the African continental free trade area, we are not only focusing on trade in goods, we are also focusing on trade in services. So these sector protocols in SADC are absolutely relevant to the acquis of what already exists in SADC, and that has to be respected. So SADC's own trade and services agenda, its finance investment agenda under the finance and investment protocol, the annex on investment, Annex 1 there, is extremely important. The protocol on transport, for example, very important, because it is an area that we have focused on as far as road transport and other modes of transport are concerned, which are integral, not only to trade, to intra-regional trade, but to our trade with the rest of the continent, and also important in terms of our industrial development more generally. Honourable members, I mentioned very briefly the tripartite free trade area, and this is extremely important in terms of Article 19 of the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is one of those trading arrangements that is recognized in the African Union, the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. Although it is still under negotiation, so it is still work in progress, it is recognized, so it will also continue to exist. Just a little bit of an update as far as this important initiative is concerned. We recognize that it has its origins, as we mentioned yesterday, more than a decade, almost 2 decades ago, where the 3 regional economic communities recognized that the extent of overlap of membership between SADC, EAC, and COMESA made it important for us to cooperate. And so we saw the tripartite initiative initially among the secretariats of the 3 regional economic communities adopt very practical programs of cooperation related, for example, to trade facilitation, customs and border management, and then of course also in the solution of non-tariff or the resolution of non-tariff barriers more recently. So this was then consolidated by the heads of state and government in a decision in October 2008 in Kampala, Uganda, to say, let's negotiate a comprehensive free trade agreement among, at that stage, the 26 member states. And this then led to the start of negotiations among those member states. And as negotiations began, it became evident that it would not make sense, it would not be in the interest of this new initiative or in the interest of any member states to roll back what the constituent regional economic communities had already achieved. And this is where the principle of the acquis was adopted. It is used in the World Trade Organization and particularly also in the European Union, the most integrated arrangement globally. And at that stage, it was given very specific definition. So the member states, our negotiating teams, actually gave it a very specific meaning. And it means, in the context of the tripartite free trade area, that we will respect the existing trade arrangements, in particular as they relate to trade in goods, and only those member states which are not party together to a regional trade arrangement would negotiate liberalization between them. So as a very good example that I mentioned yesterday, the member states of SADC do not have a trade agreement with the members of East Africa, except for Tanzania, because of course Tanzania is part of SADC. So negotiations between SADC and the EAC minus Tanzania, excuse me, have made a lot of progress. And by July last year, they had completed the tariff negotiations. There are a few outstanding issues, as we mentioned yesterday, on the rules of origin, clothing and textiles, the automotive sector, edible oils and sugar. Not surprisingly, as we mentioned yesterday, these are exactly the sectors where we are still negotiating rules of origin under the AFCFTA. So these are sensitive products for all our member states, both within the tripartite free trade region, but also continentally. So it matters from an industrial development perspective that we're taking more time to look at how we craft those rules of origin for these important sectors. Where do we stand in terms of the ratifications? 8 member states have now ratified the agreement, and they are South Africa, Egypt, Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, Namibia, Burundi, and Botswana. We need to reach 14 ratifications for the agreement to enter into force. So we have some way to go. And not to say there's a race between the tripartite FTA and the AFCFTA, but we will watch to see how we progress on these ratifications in the coming months and in the next couple of years. This initiative, honorable members, was also a landmark development in that it is anchored on what has commonly become known as a developmental regional integration paradigm. And this developmental regional integration agenda is anchored on 3 pillars. It's anchored on a pillar of tariff liberalization, trade liberalization, industrial development, and infrastructure development. So very important to keep in mind that there is strong reference and recognition within the tripartite initiative that industrial development matters, infrastructure development matters, and that trade or market integration is particularly important, but that the 3 pillars of the tripartite initiative overall are of course closely connected. We recognize the infrastructure deficit, but unless we look at the soft infrastructure, the regulations that govern access to the services which the infrastructure makes possible, then of course we are not getting the best advantage of that infrastructure investment. Industrial development, honorable members, this is absolutely critical. It is a foundational issue. We have to improve and diversify our capacity to produce tradable goods and services. And all of our member states have adopted industrial strategies at national level, and every regional economic community has a regional industrial strategy as well. On the trade agenda, it is not only tariff liberalization that matters, of course. The important focus on trade facilitation cuts across regional economic communities. It enjoys very, very specific focus within the African Continental Free Trade Area as well. And we know that there are potentially a lot of benefits that more efficient border management, more reduced times in transit as our trucks cross borders can add enormous value to intra-regional trade, but as we mentioned yesterday, also our trade with global trading partners. So very important to keep that in mind. And that leads to, logically, the question about the AFCFTA and where specifically its important contribution will come from. And honorable members, this also leads us into a little bit of a discussion, if we have time, Honorable Chair, I would take guidance from you about the impact of COVID on the AFCFTA, where we stand and what the plans are going forward. These two photographs, honorable members, tell a very important story. The one is taken at the Kasumbalesa border post in December 2018. This is that important border post between DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Zambia. And the one on the left-hand side, this is on the way to the border at Komati Port between South Africa and Mozambique. This is taken in the middle of the lockdown, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And honorable members, what we see here very clearly is that congestion at the border posts, the long queues, the waiting times, and keep in mind that for business, time in transit, waiting time at the border has significant cost implications, but also, very importantly, if we look at some of the cargo on the trucks, this could be perishable goods, it could be goods that are important for food security, but it can also be goods, as we see here on the left-hand side, that are important for infrastructure development, that are important to facilitate industrial development in our economies. So trade facilitation takes on a very, very significant dimension. As we mentioned yesterday, of course, there is the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement. It came into force in February 2017. All of our member states are party to this agreement. We've undertaken specific obligations that we have to implement over the short, the medium, and the longer term. And of course, there is also a WTO facility, a funding facility that makes funding available to assist us to implement aspects of that agreement and the commitments we've undertaken. It's also an area where we've had support from some of our development partners, a number of development partners who work together with the World Customs Organization, with our national revenue authorities across SADC to improve customs and border management, improve our agencies that are issuing the standards and rules of origin certificates that increase the transparency, accountability, and the broader governance of these trade facilitation processes. So extremely important. And I would certainly go as far as to say that I think in the area of trade facilitation, this is one of the areas where the AFCFTA can make a significant contribution, because even if we are not opening up the SADC trade regime, we're not further liberalizing beyond what we have in the FTA already. If we are improving trade facilitation, customs and border management, we start using digital certificates and payments, digital payments become standard, then all of our trade, even trade among SADC member states, will benefit. So the impact of trade facilitation is a very comprehensive and very deep impact across not only the new trade, which the AFCFTA will unlock, but also for existing trade. So in summary then, when we take a look at what the contribution of the AFCFTA will be, it will liberalize trade amongst member states of the African Union, which are not together part of an existing regional economic community or trade arrangement, such as the tripartite eventually. Perhaps even more important is the non-tariff agenda. We've talked a little bit about trade facilitation, but honorable members, we know from our own experience in SADC also that when tariffs come down, we often see an increase in non-tariff barriers. So there is strong focus in the AFCFTA also on the elimination of non-tariff barriers, on regulatory cooperation, and improving governance, more transparency through notifications to the AFCFTA Secretariat when members adopt measures. Transparency, honorable members, provides a lot of information to the private sector. It improves the quality of governance, which is extremely important for investors to be attracted to our region. If we are improving trade facilitation, making it easier to trade, our customs and border procedures are more transparent, our officials are accountable, this creates a much more inviting environment, an enabling environment for investment, which we really do need to improve our industrial capacity and our capacity to trade with one another and with global trade. These issues, in summary then, will enhance our competitiveness, not only for trade amongst ourselves, but also in global trade. It's really important to keep in mind. What lessons do we take from COVID for the AFCFTA, honorable members? Just very briefly, I think, as we all know, COVID is not only a national, but a global pandemic. It means that the impact of COVID transcends national borders. So it has no jurisdictional boundaries. And as soon as we are dealing with a crisis which transcends national borders, it is important not only that our governments respond at the national level, but we also take a look at the regional and global responses. What we recognize for Africa, honorable members, is that although this is in the first instance a health crisis, it has become a global financial and economic crisis. We are all seeing that as pressure on our governments to provide assistance and to bolster our fragile healthcare systems, for example, is very much in the spotlight. But for Africa, honorable members, COVID-19 is a fundamental development crisis. It has shone the spotlight on existing vulnerabilities. It has also highlighted from a trade perspective that the impact, for example, on women, informal cross-border traders, is particularly severe. So if one country closes its border, as it is entitled as a sovereign state to do in order to curb the spread of the virus, it immediately cuts off contact to the neighboring countries and potentially along our trade corridors to many, many other countries. We have to recognize that many of our countries are landlocked. Many, as we mentioned yesterday, are least developed countries. All of our countries on the African continent, and this is certainly true in SADC too, have responded very quickly to the crisis, to the pandemic, by taking national measures. And we've also seen at the regional level, so for example, at the SADC and the COMESA level, that we have had guidelines being issued for member states, guidelines in terms of customs and border management, transit procedures, testing for truck drivers, and many, many other practical issues. It is really important to note also, and this is true in the African Continental Free Trade Area, it is true in SADC's legal instruments, trade agreements contain general exceptions which permit extraordinary responses in times of crisis. So what member states have done in terms of adopting these measures is legitimate. Our trade agreements recognize that in times of extraordinary crisis, it is imperative that national governments respond. So very important, they are not acting outside their competence, they're not acting ultra vires. This is absolutely legitimate. The important lesson that we take from the COVID pandemic, honorable members, is that we are interconnected, and therefore a measure adopted by one country will impact neighboring countries. And if we look at our trade corridors, some of these important conduits for trade with global partners, as we are importing protective personal equipment, pharmaceutical products from global trade partners, they have to have an entry point, and most of those goods come to our shores via sea transport, maritime transport, and then move on to, in most instances, road transport. So the trade corridors, the intermodal transport linkages are extremely important, and they emphasize how connected we are and how important coordination and collective responses to a pandemic are. I think this is perhaps one of the fundamental lessons. It also has taught us that trade facilitation, again, in times of crisis, is absolutely critical. What we have seen, honorable members, is that many countries have started adopting digital trade solutions. So e-certificates of origin, e-certificates of standards, and so on. And I think this is perhaps one of those areas where COVID is pushing the boundaries for us a little bit to consider how we can benefit in good times too from adopting digital trade solutions. If under conditions of the pandemic, e-certificates of origin can actually work, other members accept them, if our country issues them, then perhaps we should start thinking about adopting digital trade solutions par for the course, in good times as well as bad. It has also, honorable members, focused attention on the capacity within our domestic institutions that manage trade matters, import-export permits, which are required for essential products in many of our countries, where we require permits to export medical equipment or pharmaceutical products, or even food, where our member states are concerned about food security. The agency, in some cases it's the ministry, in some cases it's a national trade body. In South Africa, it's the International Trade Administration Commission that processes these permits. The capacity of these agencies and the ministries, those departments in the ministries, have been tested severely. And those officers have been working extremely long hours to process these permits. These are areas that we should be noting for further capacity development going forward, because effective management at the border relies on effective management in these behind the border agencies as well. They are closely interconnected in the trade facilitation value chain. And so we are learning a lot about how we can improve through digital solutions, through perhaps more effective management of our existing resources, but also recognizing that we need to train more officials. We need more capacity. We also need more infrastructure. So ICT infrastructure is essential if we are going to be looking at digital trade solutions. The issues around cost of data, access to the internet, access to energy. As honorable members would know, currently in South Africa, we are experiencing power outages. If we are going to use digital solutions, then reliable access to energy is a foundational requirement. So it really is shining the light on an agenda, a development agenda for us all at this really important time. On the services front, again, we mentioned this very briefly yesterday, transport regulations. If they are not harmonized across a region, then we will have challenges for our freight forwarders, for the transport companies, and maybe also in terms of truck drivers, if they need licenses or permits to cross territories, they may need a work permit and so on, a transit permit. These are all really important. If we harmonize these across the region, it reduces the transaction costs, it facilitates trade, and it makes sure that essential goods can actually reach their destination in the hospitals or where they are needed for food security. It's also important because COVID is challenging us to think about tariffs differently, import duties on food and essential products, on essential pharmaceutical products. Should we be reducing those tariffs going forward to make sure that everyone has access to healthcare products? And this becomes quite important when we're talking about a vaccine for the people. If we are importing vaccines from their production locations across the globe, are we going to be charging tariffs? Will this limit access to what is an absolutely essential good and essential service for our population? We need to look at that. Honorable members, this is just a little bit of a picture of how the pandemic is unfolding in Africa. And even at this stage, where we are seeing the numbers of positive cases, the numbers of those who are suffering from the virus, who are becoming ill, and also, very sadly, those who are dying from COVID-19 are increasing in certain parts of our continent quite dramatically. And I say that very sadly of my own country, South Africa, if we take a look at the numbers. The first case was documented on the 14th of February in Egypt. Where do we stand now? And of course, statistics tell a very important story, but they don't tell the complete story. We may be missing some because we're not rolling out testing fast enough, for example. Tracing figures on how we are tracing potentially infected and transmission cases is also important. So very important when we take a look at this figure, which was at the end of May, 54 of the African countries on the continent were affected. Now we are all affected. The reported deaths stood at 3,668. If we look now where we stand, and that is the next slide, this is from the 6th of July, so it's from last week. And what we start seeing, honorable members, are the hotspots, the so-called hotspots on the continent. And we start seeing that the large economies like South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria is increasing as well, how the confirmed cases are increasing. This is more than a week ago, honorable members. The death toll had risen to 11,390. It is much higher as we speak now. We're starting to see the pandemic enter a very virulent phase of spreading very fast. And the scientists are indicating at this stage that we expect it to peak around September, October. But of course, this may not be the same in all African countries. So we have to look very carefully still at the measures, the response measures that member states are taking to curb the transmission of the virus. We still see that travel bans and restrictions are very much in place for most countries. And as we mentioned yesterday, of course, that impacts the tourism industry, it impacts transport and many, many related industries. Many of our countries, not only in Africa, but developing countries and least developed countries across the world, are suffering very, very seriously. Debt levels are rising, and of course, the pressure on the fiscus of our countries as we need to roll out healthcare services, food services, and many, many other essential services from government side, because our safety nets are not comprehensive and extensive in most of our countries, placing a lot of pressure on our economies. Already in April, the chief economist of the Africa region at the World Bank said that it would be really important if we have a debt freeze for African economies. That would free up at that point in time $44 billion to address COVID. And I think, honorable members, it's so important to think not only about addressing the pandemic now, but having a look at what is our recovery and reconstruction plan, because so many millions of Africans across the continent have lost jobs. What do we do about all the businesses that have closed down? Many SMEs may not be able to start up again. So what are we going to do in terms of promoting and assisting small-scale entrepreneurs to start up businesses again? This is just a very overall picture of the vulnerability of African countries. And as we mentioned yesterday, we have 33 of the world's least developed countries on Africa. 14 of them are landlocked. State capacity to manage the pandemic, specifically our healthcare systems, even though the pandemic has not peaked yet, we have seen it is not only the physical infrastructure that is lacking in many, many countries, but it is also the medical professionals that we simply do not have sufficient supply of. And honorable members, this is an irony, because if we look at some international destinations, then we find many of our nurses and other medical professionals who've been trained in Africa are playing a very important role now in assisting the United Kingdom, for example, to deal with the pandemic. So many of our health professionals have actually gone to global destinations to seek better economic opportunities. We need to be looking at how we address that, not only how many professionals we train, but how we retain them so that we become more resilient to deal with pandemics such as these. The digital divide, honorable members, I think we mentioned this yesterday too, for many children across the continent and certainly across many SADC countries, schools and universities are closed, and there simply is a lack of connectivity, both in terms of ICT infrastructure, but also access to broadband, access to data, which means these children and these university students are not able to continue with their studies. And this is going to cause an enormous gap, not only in their learning processes, but further down the line in our labor market. So the impact on skills development in the future as a result of the pandemic needs to be taken into account as well. We've talked a little bit about trade already. I do want to emphasize the impact of informal cross-border trade and the informal economy more generally. In all of our economies, it remains an extremely important source of income and livelihoods for many, many millions of families. And this is where discussion around, for example, the introduction of simplified trade regimes is really important. Discussion I know is ongoing at SADC, but we don't have a simplified trade regime functional yet, but also at the AFCFTA level. And then, honorable members, the last bullet point, gender and crises, the gender dimension of the pandemic is very under-researched. What the data indicates so far in terms of the incidence of the COVID-19 virus is that women are not as much affected as men. However, the impact of providing care, of providing essential services, if we take a look at some countries, the majority of nurses are women, impacts gender very, very severely. So this, I think, is extremely important. The national emergency measures we talked about, honorable members, they are absolutely legitimate. National constitutions provide for states of emergency or national disaster. Our member states in SADC, some have adopted a state of emergency, others have adopted and declared a national state of disaster. There are very important regulations governing these important decisions. So in the case of South Africa, our government declared a national disaster, and that can exist for 3 months, after which it has to be renewed on a month-to-month basis. It was recently renewed, and we will be under a state of national disaster under the National Disaster Act until the 15th of August. In neighboring countries to South Africa, other SADC member states, states of emergency have been declared. The important point is the rule of law is not suspended. So what we have seen in the case of South Africa is a number of challenges have come from various quarters, from stakeholders who are challenging government's adoption of particular measures to stem the transmission of the virus. So the rule of law is not suspended. National states of emergency and disaster are part of the legal and institutional ecosystem. It is legitimate to declare a national state of emergency or a state of disaster under conditions such as the current ones. So very important to keep that in mind. The regional impact, honorable members, I'll finish off now, is so important. I think the borders demarcate jurisdiction between one sovereign state and another sovereign state. It is the legitimate right of a sovereign state to take national measures, but border closures have impacts, and so coordination and discussion with neighbors is critical. It impacts transit to other countries as well. This, and I think I'd like to finish off in the next minute or so, Honorable Chair, is where we are seeing how vital the role of regional economic communities such as SADC is under conditions of crisis and pandemic. SADC issued emergency guidelines on the 6th of April, calling for digital trade solutions, for cooperation, and so on. And these are really important. Unfortunately, of course, guidelines are not enforceable. So at the end of the day, it is still up to the national governments they make the decision about the measures that they implement. And I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. Honorable members, I think I will stop there. I have a number of other slides which we can have a quick look at. Let's just go to the final one. This is just a collection of some of the measures that member states across the continent have adopted: licensing, suspension of import duties, import restrictions, export restrictions, waivers of duty on medicines, and so on. These are very important measures that have been taken at the national level. A country like Egypt banned the export of pulses and grains to assure food security. These are quite legitimate, very important to keep in mind. What we've also seen is that the private sector is really important. Our transport companies, our logistics, courier companies, the freight forwarders, how important they have become as our lifeline to get essential goods, medicines, and food across the borders. I think this is extremely important to keep in mind. This is just very briefly, honorable members, you would be familiar with the SADC guidelines. I think they are extremely important. They aim to harmonize and coordinate transport-related policies and measures, and they encourage member states to simplify and automate trade and transport facilitation processes. The East African community and the COMESA region have also adopted very important guidelines. This is very important. Here we've seen that coordination between the SADC Business Council and the COMESA Business Council has also been an important focal point. It is important for our private sector associations, those business associations, also to provide input into the discussion. They have a lot of experience, which is useful for us to learn from for dealing with future challenges. This is the COMESA Business Council. Now, finally, the COVID-19 and the AFCFTA. We know that the processes have been put on hold, and we are now seeing very slowly digital meetings, technical working groups becoming back to life again, but it is extremely difficult, honorable members. There are practical challenges. Connectivity across the continent is uneven. We've recently seen in Ethiopia with the internet shutdown for about a week what the impact of such measures can be. So these are posing significant challenges to the AFCFTA process, but we will persevere and we will triumph at the end of the virus and this pandemic. From the Trade Law Center, we have a number of resources which are available on the website, and we have a catalog of all of these measures that are being adopted so that we can study them, assess their impact, and plan for future crises and pandemics that may come our way. They may not be viruses, but they could be climate and other challenges that we have to be prepared for. Thank you very much, honorable members. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Trudy, for that concise presentation. Members, ladies and gentlemen, now is our opportunity to interact with Trudy by way of questions. I see a hand up already. Honorable Agle, you may have the floor, please.
Through you, Chair, we do have some questions on the chat. Some participants have indicated some questions. We could also give them a chance to ask their questions.
If we may go ahead with those until the owner realizes that he is on mute.
Honorable Chair, if I may recognize the contribution from Honorable Bani Karumbo, I think this is a very important contribution that he's made here. And the discussion in July 2019, and if I may just, if Honorable Karumbo would like to speak to this.
Hello.
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, ST, but I'm still learning the ropes around these IT instruments. So I just wanted to recall what the Honorable Chair has said during that specific plenary assembly when this topic was discussed by the committee that he's now chairing. So it was just a highlight of the things that needed to be done in order to take the ACFTA forward. So, and I thought I perhaps need not to repeat the highlights of the few things, but with your permission and if I may, I also wanted to highlight a few things to contextualize the discussion to what next after these important sessions that we've had from Truti. May I?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. I think having benefited a lot from Truti and also the well-researched presentation that was that the SADC country is benefiting from, I think we take note that the ratification remains the responsibility of Parliament, and having ratified it presents a duty on Parliament to make sure what they would have ratified is then taken forward through legislative measures. And I perhaps think that we may need to make mention of what are those specific legislative measures that needs to be put in place. What laws would need to be enacted domestically to make sure that we realize the objectives of the ACFTA, and also what are the specific budgetary provisions, because the budget is a big animal, and when we do not provide specifically for some of these instruments, and also when we do not exercise specific oversight to ensure that those budgetary provisions are realized for the purpose, then some of these noble ideals are not left through. And lastly, some of the specific oversight measures. We spoke about the standards that need to be put in place in order to realize the rules of origin and some of these things. What are those specific things that Parliament need to go through and through their portfolio committees need to undertake to ensure that the objectives of this important regional instrument is left through? And lastly, I would contribute humbly that the continued partnership with civil society, and especially civil society, which is research-based, such as TRALAC and others, at the national level, I'm sure this should be able to take the objectives of this instrument forward and make sure that the ordinary people at the borders are able to benefit from the regional continental instrument on trade. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Bani. I'm sure we can revert to Honorable Agle once more, if he is ready.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Honorable, we can hear you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like also to thank Madam Mrs. Trudy for her presentation. I have two questions that I want to ask because I'm a bit worried in regard to the tariff. Given the COVID situation that we are facing now, maybe what kind of protection that are in place or need to be put in place to prevent any further increase in tariff, especially if we were to face with scarcity of resources and deployment of resources from certain countries within our region. So how will we prevent additional tariff from that? And then my second question is because we have the implementation of the AFTA, within the implementation of the AFTA. So when it comes, she has mentioned like the issue of vaccine, the vaccine. If we were to, a vaccine were to be made available in the future now, so when it comes to the deployment and of the vaccine itself, how will the AFTA play the role to help that? Because we have heard the United States itself that if they were to be ready with the vaccine, they will keep all to themselves. So under the AFTA, what role can be played so that if there is a rediscovered vaccine, so that African countries also can have access to this vaccine? This is my two question. Thank you.
Trudy, I believe you may respond, and then we'll take some more questions as we go.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair, and thank you very much to the Honourable members for those very important questions. Let me start with Honourable Karumba's question first. What is the role of the Parliamentary Forum when it comes to implementation of these very important aspects of the African Continental Free Trade Area? And I think this is where the SADC Parliamentary Forum has a unique vantage point across the whole region of the Southern African Development Community. Of course, the interface with the national parliaments through the membership of the Parliamentary Forum adds an important insight into what is happening at the national levels, and where in fact members of parliament, the national parliament, can hold the national executive to account. But keeping in mind that in the case of the Southern African Development Community, we have a regional trade arrangement. In other words, there is a collective and consolidated coordination among the SADC member states. The oversight role from the SADC Parliamentary Forum becomes extremely important. And this is, let's take a practical example on the trade facilitation issues. When we take a look at the SADC guidelines, for example, that were issued at the beginning of April, yes, they are not mandatory, but they are very, very important practical guidelines that have been developed by the collective of the SADC membership to facilitate trade, to reduce border times, and to increase access to essential healthcare products, medicines, but also food security. And it is incumbent then on the Parliamentary Forum members, I would say, to actually have a monitoring process to take a look at where we are finding challenges. Do we have a lack of capacity at certain border posts? Do we have a situation where the opening hours across the region differ for example, some of the very practical issues which they can raise quite legitimately to say, this could be an area where coordination could bring enormous collective benefits, so that we don't have trucks queuing for 90 kilometers as we've had during the time of the pandemic already. So I think in terms of having a regional purview, the particular advantage of the Parliamentary Forum here is that this institution has the benefit of the detailed feedback and input from the member states, but also has an opportunity to take a regional perspective. And trade facilitation, for example, just to use that one, is such an important one because it matters not only for one member state. What we've seen is that if one member state closes its border, immediately its neighbor's border is effectively also closed. So a border closure by one member state effectively means that the other side of the border is closed too. So it requires coordination and discussion and assessment and taking a look at what is in the interest of the entire membership of the SADC community. So I think this is really important. A border post has two sides. I think it's the most graphic example of why we need coordination. And this immediately provides a strong rationale for the oversight, the monitoring function of the SADC Parliamentary Forum. So I think very, very important when it comes to, for example, the acceptance and the use of electronic, say, rules of origin certificates. If we have some member states using them, effective trade facilitation means that they have to be accepted by other member states. So again, there's a very strong regional dimension. If one country decides that it can issue those certificates, this decision will fail badly if the neighboring countries do not accept that certificate, that electronic certificate, as legitimate. So again, the Parliamentary Forum, which has a regional overview, can pick up some of these challenges and bring them to the attention not only of SADC, but also of the member states through their national parliaments, to the attention of the national executive. So I think what we are learning are some very practical issues about how important regional institutions are under conditions of a crisis such as this, and how regional coordination is absolutely essential. It is in all our national interests to coordinate, to cooperate, and to make sure that there is harmonization across the region to support our collective response to a pandemic which is affecting all of us, not only one member state. I think the very practical questions that relate to the tariff and the implementation of the AFCFTA and the vaccine, this, honorable members, these are really, really fundamental issues, because in times of crisis, the reaction of most member states is to look inward and to try to close the borders. When it comes to the import tariff, what we are seeing, if we look at the list of responses that I briefly showed members in the presentation, we will see there are some examples of countries having lowered tariffs on protective personal equipment, for example, but there are many others that have raised tariffs. And that is an indication that they want to protect their domestic industry, and also that they need the tariff revenue. So it's a very difficult situation because our fiscal situations are vulnerable, are fragile. So tariff revenue is an important issue, and domestic industry needs to be supported in many, many different ways. So in some countries, what we've seen is even in the clothing and textile industry, some of the producers are now making masks, but they're saying we can only make those masks profitably if you stop the import of cheap imports coming from other countries. So put a tariff on that import. Obviously, the imposition of tariffs is subject to the rules of SADC, but also the other trade arrangements we belong to, including the World Trade Organization. So there's a ceiling beyond which we cannot go because we have a bound rate which we've committed in the World Trade Organization. So it is important that we monitor that member states are not transgressing in terms of their tariff responses to COVID. I think that's very, very important to keep in mind. The issue around the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area and the vaccine for all of us. Unfortunately, honorable members, we have seen some very, very unfortunate responses from countries like the United States on issues such as this. And I think this again raises the importance of not only looking at national responses, regional responses, but also global responses. This is a global pandemic. We have seen the virus spread from Asia to Europe to the Americas. It's in Africa, it's in Latin America, it is across the globe. It means that we need global responses. And so it emphasizes that the current crisis in the World Trade Organization is a problem for all of us. We need to rethink and reform what is happening in the World Trade Organization, because this is the forum where we should be turning to when it comes to trade issues that impact the global economy as we're seeing now. So very important. I think very interesting also is that some African countries are starting to participate in global programs to develop vaccines and to manufacture vaccines. And honorable members, we can take some lessons here from the TRIPS flexibilities, which some of our countries in SADC adopted in order to produce antiretroviral drugs to be able to do with the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And some of those flexibilities we should be looking at very carefully now. But it is also important that we look at cooperation in terms of the manufacture of not only a vaccine, but also the support drugs, which are used to treat those who do contract the virus. So the vaccine, obviously, absolutely critical, because if we look at the spread of the virus across the globe now, it makes the development of a vaccine which is available to all an absolute imperative, because the science seems to indicate that the virus is going to be with us for quite a long time. So this is where there are some initiatives with pharmaceutical companies in Europe, AstraZeneca, for example, joining with governments in the European Union to develop and to be able to market the vaccine so that it does become available to all. But this has to be absolutely not something where the ability to pay for a vaccine actually costs lives in Africa. So very important that we engage our development partners, that we take a look at our pharmaceutical industries, we look at foreign investment in those sectors now. We need to strengthen our capacity, not only for this pandemic, but for others that surely will come to our shores. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Trudy. I realize Uneni Kurasha has a question. Mr. Kurasha, if you could paraphrase your question for Trudy's benefit, as well as honorable members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Trudy, for very elucidated presentation. My question is very straightforward, Trudy. I'm sure you would have looked at them, but The first one recognizes the dichotomy in terms of the structure of our economies, where they are dominated by the informal sector. And the African Continental Free Trade Area seems to anchor around assumptions of capacity to produce tradable goods, industrialization, against the reality of between 80 to 90% of some of our economies being informalized. So what is on offer for the majority in terms of the informal sector, from your understanding, in terms of the African Continental Free Trade area? The second question arises from the first one. If you think that there is something on offer for the informal sector in the trading regime, do you see a role of parliamentarians in terms of bridging the gap between policy and the access to the same by the role players in the informal sector? And if there is a role, what is that practical? What role practically? What could the following day parliamentarians be doing to bridge that gap? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The floor is yours, Trudy.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair, and thank you very much to Honourable Kurasha for that important focus on both the informal economy, the SMEs, but also informal cross-border trade and what the AFCFTA actually offers. Honourable members, at this stage, the important contribution that we see coming from the AFCFTA for the informal economy, and I'm using informal economy, not just informal cross-border traders, is really to be found in the trade facilitation contributions to make cross-border trade easier. However, I think we do have to keep in mind that at this stage, certainly my view, is that this does not go far enough. So we are not yet discussing the introduction of a simplified trade regime within the AFCFTA. And I think a simplified trade regime, which we can craft in different ways, it may mean that small traders or traders dealing with small consignments of goods below a threshold in terms of value or quantity of certain products can be designated, and that smaller trade component will be subject to less documentary requirements, perhaps even a separate channel at border posts to facilitate and expedite trade across borders. Because I think what we are realizing is that when we look at informal cross-border trade, it is closely associated with the very vulnerable communities in our economies across the continent. And many of the informal cross-border traders, some of them are generating a daily income, some are generating a weekly income. And very important that livelihoods on a daily basis are linked for many of those informal cross-border traders. We see this so much across the regional economic communities, where in many of the RECs, it is predominantly women who are literally crossing borders on a daily basis. They generate a daily income for the daily needs for survival of their family and their households. So they are incredibly vulnerable. And when a border is closed, it is not only stopping informal trade, it is definitely severely impacting livelihoods of potentially millions of households across the continent. So this is an area where, and I think, honorable members, we need to be making notes, very, very careful notes from the experience under COVID, because COVID has, to some extent, through the pause in the negotiations, given us an opportunity to look at areas where we can improve on what is currently on the AFCFTA agenda. Any trade agreement, whether it is still being negotiated or even if it is finalized, honorable members, we can add to it, it can be amended. It is up to the member states. It is very important that we recognize that integration, including the AFCFTA, is member state driven. The member states decide what will be on the agenda, how we can augment it and add to it and develop it, which is so important right now because we are learning lessons that we probably did not anticipate when the negotiating agenda for the AFCFTA was developed. So it provides an opportunity for us. We should not miss this opportunity. And this links very much to the second question from Honorable Kurasha. What is the role of parliamentarians? And I would take that to mean parliamentarians at national, but also at the regional, and also, of course, at the African Union, at the Pan-African parliamentary level. Parliamentarians, I think, are an extremely important role player. They are the connector between the broad stakeholder communities, between all of us, in our countries and in our regions and across our continent, and the executive. They are there to play a very important role, not only to hold the executive to account, but also to be a conduit of information. And therefore, they are the parliamentarians, and this is so important for the SADC Parliamentary Forum. They are our representatives as stakeholders in the informal trading community, in the SME sector, in the areas bordering our borders, so the border communities, but across the entire spectrum of economy and society for the Southern African development community. They have a role to bring to light, to bring to the attention of the national parliaments important issues that they are getting access to information about, to raise issues, to ask questions, to put issues that are not yet on the agenda, to put them on that agenda so that they are considered, and so that we force our executive, force maybe not such a good word to use, but that they actually come to the attention of the executive so that they can be addressed not only at national level, but also through an initiative such as the AFCFTA. So a very unique position that the Parliamentary Forum actually has in this context, and particularly during this time of COVID.
We seem to have lost our presenter, but nonetheless, honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, kindly allow me to recognize in our midst the presence of Ambassador Juk Lefoko from Kenya. Your Excellency, we are honored and happy that you could make time to join us. Ladies and gentlemen, time is not on our side, but I had a quick question for Trudy, if she is still all ears before we round up.
Yes, thank you, Honorable Chair.
My question, Trudy, is on the free movement protocol. Goods and services cannot move alone. Thus, it is important also to ratify the free movement protocol. I notice a disconnect between our country's enthusiasm for free trade, for the free trade area, and cold feet towards free movement, which may not augur well for AFCFTA. How can we mitigate this within the SADC region? I realize that to date, none of the SADC countries has ratified the protocol on free movement of people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. I share your concern absolutely. I think you're absolutely right to point out that goods do not move on their own. And increasingly, when we take a look at the service economy of African countries, if we look at the continent as a whole, services are contributing on average at least 50% of total GDP. In some countries, the contribution of services is much, much higher. And the movement of services suppliers across borders becomes extremely important as well. So movement of persons is important for trade in goods, for trade in services, and overall to increase the impact and the importance of our regional integration initiatives. You're absolutely right. The separate protocol on free movement of persons was presented for signature alongside the agreement establishing the AFCFTA in March 2018 in Kigali. But the uptake has been extremely limited. So movement of persons remains a very, very, very sensitive issue. There are a few countries which are moving ahead and adopting national legislation and regulations, which means that visas for all African citizens can be taken on arrival. So for example, a country like Rwanda, Ghana's made important moves and improvements as far as visas for African citizens are concerned as well. But by and large, movement on the African continent remains highly restricted. This is an area that we do need to improve on, because unless we actually start trusting the dispensations across the continent to be able to manage movement of persons effectively, we are building in stumbling blocks to our own integration and development. So for me, this is an absolute priority. But there are also related issues, honourable members. For example, when we get back to air travel, we have a lot of restrictions in other services sectors which are related to the movement of persons via air transport. And I'll give you one example. If, for example, you want to buy travel insurance, and I'm in South Africa, say Tralak is hosting a conference in Kenya, and there will be participants from Rwanda flying to Kenya. And as a small nonprofit, we are buying the air ticket. We cannot in South Africa buy travel insurance for that expert traveling from Rwanda to Kenya, although we can buy that expert an air ticket. So there are restrictions in the trade and services sectors related to insurances, travel insurances, and financial services, which also inhibit movement of persons across borders. So the movement of persons is a very sensitive issue, but it relates to other areas of governance as well. And therefore, when we look at the trade and services agenda in the African Continental Free Trade Area, it deals with the movement of services suppliers, and this could be accountants moving across borders to provide services, educational experts moving across borders, and so on. We need to be focusing on the movement of those professionals, but also on the free movement of persons much more generally, as the Protocol on Free Movement of Persons envisages as well. Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. That's such an important issue. I really do hope that we will be able to address that.
Thank you very much, Trudy, for such an engaging presentation. There's more questions coming, but I must assure you this one shall be the last from Adolf Adolf, if you are there, you have the floor, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thanks for the presentation. Very much informative. So my question is a quick one. I just wanted to understand the linkages, if any, in terms of how the African Free Trade Agreement will motivate African countries to address some of the governance challenges that have been bedeviling the continent, especially the leadership in a majority of our countries. Agreeably, challenges with governance and leadership have been some of the stumbling blocks to the realization of free trade zones and, of course, their functionality in terms of efficacy. Thank you.
Trudy, before you come in, please allow me to squeeze one more question from Honorable Tsepang, please.
You're most welcome.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I thought you didn't notice my hand, which I raised quite a while ago. Thank you so much, Trudy, for the presentation. I have just one question. I think for some of us, we could be gearing towards considering the African Continental Free Trade Area, but then from a layperson's point of view, some issues need to be clarified, even for members of parliament, vis-a-vis opening up the market zone or the market space. Now, for countries that are largely importing, like Lesotho, I think over 80% of what we consume is what we import. So that says to us, opening up the area, the free trade area, somebody can view it as opening up an opportunity for others, for other nations to actually take over the market space. Please make me primarily understand that this is an opportunity for countries such as Lesotho to grab and not be frustrated or worried about when one considers that we are a largely importing country. That's my only question. Thank you so much.
The floor is yours, Ms. Trudy.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. These are two tough questions that are coming towards the end of our discussion now. I think that let me have a look at Honourable Adolf's question, and this relates fundamental governance issues, national governance issues to the AFCFTA, and a very important connection, of course, between trade agreements that we conclude and national governance issues and national capacity issues in government, for example, is related to the implementation of the commitments that our member states undertake. If our leadership is committed to make the African Continental Free Trade Area work, if they are committed to develop domestic governance to increase transparency, accountability, and legitimacy of this particularly important initiative, then we will see that the agreement is effectively implemented and that domestic institutions which are responsible for making this a success will actually be taking it very, very seriously. At the end of the day, whether the AFCFTA succeeds to bring all the benefits that we really do hope it will bring depends to a very large extent, I think, as Honourable Adolf is mentioning here, on what happens at the national level, what happens within the member states. So this is something, again, where, as far as the Parliamentary Forum is concerned, because the PF looks not only at one member state, but at a regional perspective, it has a unique opportunity to take a look at the implementation, the progress, how the SADC membership are actually giving effect to the commitments that they have undertaken in the AFCFTA. And this is where engaging with a broad stakeholder community about these issues is particularly important. The SADC-PF can be the voice on the AFCFTA, on the governance, the implementation, giving effect to commitments that have been undertaken by the SADC member states. And that's really, really important. Transparency, shining a light on governance issues, shining a light on implementation issues can very often bring about positive change in terms of how our governments respond, in terms of how seriously they actually take the commitments that they have undertaken. Implementation, honorable members, has bedeviled all of our regional economic communities across the African continent. To some extent, it's easy to sign an agreement after we've negotiated, but the hard work means giving effect to it at national level. And that tests national governance and leadership very, very severely. How committed are we really to make this work? And that question relates very much also to the challenges of the small countries amongst ourselves, the least developed countries amongst ourselves, like Lesotho. Lesotho is the least developed country, it's landlocked, very small economy. Extremely important that we have a look at where the benefits for the countries like Lesotho, and there are many others that face specific development challenges, are going to come from. And this is where I think we need to take a look at some of these support initiatives, such as the adjustment facility that the Afrexim Bank is making available. It's $1 billion US, which is available particularly for smaller countries, because if they do open their markets, then we will see potentially more goods coming in from other sources from which we may not have been trading previously, because the AFCFTA opens up new trade. That may well cause challenges for domestic producers. So what should we be doing domestically? And let's have a look at support facilities such as this. But what do we need to do domestically to support our small entrepreneurs, the SMEs, so that they can weather the storm of increased competition that might come our way? But it is also, honorable members, really important that we keep in mind here that as member states of the Southern African Development Community, we have been focusing on a regional industrialization strategy. So regional value chain linkages become part of how we can deal with increased competition in our markets as a result of the AFCFTA. And this is where Lesotho, I think, has some very good experience to draw on. What we've started to see is that there has been foreign direct investment coming from other African countries into its clothing and textile industry, into automotive components manufacture, for example. That builds more resilient cross-border industrial linkages, and that will help small countries to be able to address some of the challenges that come with increased trade as they open up their markets. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair.
Thank you so much, Ms. Trudy. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this session, but before anything else, this SG has a hand up. It was in the past. Thank you. May I kindly request honorable members to send to our committee clerk areas for future engagement in terms of the work of our committee. If this could be done perhaps before the end of the week. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for participating in this seminar, and I would also like to kindly request you to join me in expressing gratitude to Ms. Trudy for that lucid two-day presentation. It was very enlightening. The presentation has revealed just how much as a region we need to ensure that trade facilitation is prioritized in every sense. Indeed, it is clear that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will exist alongside the existing communities. This therefore challenges us as honorable members to ensure that our manufacturing sector in our respective countries is expanded and begins to produce tradable goods in order to fully appreciate the opportunities presented by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I am confident that honorable members and other participants have greatly benefited from this interaction. We look forward to meeting you again in the near future, Ms. Trudy. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, honorable members. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
It's been a great pleasure, honorable members and honorable chair. I wish you all safety, good health, and look forward to meeting you again soon. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great honor.
Thank you so much. I call this meeting to a close.